Next up, let's add a login section to our website, and then let's deal with a little bit of the workflow of how token-based authentication would work in an Angular 2 HTTP application. Now notice I said workflow. I just really want to go over the larger points of how authentication would work. I don't really want to go too far into the details. We'll save that all for another more in-depth authentication course. To get into this though, let's talk a brief overview of how auth with tokens would work. In token-based authentication, we're going to go ahead and log into an API. By logging into an API, that API will give us a JSON web token, or a JWT. We're going to store that JWT in local storage for our browser storage. And whenever we want to make a request to that API, we'll pass in that JWT. And that's how token-based auth, as a really quick, really simple overview, will work for us. We get a JWT, which is going to be our key to this API. And every time we want to make a request to that API, we'll pass in that key. And that API will know that we are the person trying to get that information since we have that JWT. Let's start out by creating a login component, and then we'll show a login form, and then we'll talk about how the API works. Let's close everything out, and we'll go back to the basics. We'll create a new folder under app called login, and inside of that a new file, login.component.ts. New file next to that, login.component.html, ng2 component, and let's delete those. App login.component.html. And this is the login component. Let's see, what do we need for the login component? I think we'll be good to leave this as is right now. We have created a new component. We need to show our application how to use it. App module. Copy that. Let's go down and add it. Now, moving forward, right now, since this is our demo app, we're just going to be content adding everything to app module. I would highly recommend moving all of this into its own users module, and maybe even lazy loading that. But for our demo app, this is going to be totally fine. We have it registered, we have it created, we need to add it to routing now. And let's add it here under the home page. Path is login, component is login component. All right, looking good. Let's start building out this login component real quick. We'll have an h2 for login, and we'll create a form, ng submit. We'll just call this login. We'll have a form group and a label inside of that, plus an input.form control, and the name is, let's have them log in with their username. And let's bind ng model to an object which we haven't created yet, but we'll just go ahead and call this credentials.username. Break that out to its own line. We'll do the same here. Let's just copy that for password. And we'll do password. Let's copy this, that, and that'll be password. We'll have a new form group with a button of type submit. And let's do button. We'll call it login. And then here we'll show a success or error message. Let's just go ahead and, for time's sake, we'll go copy that from users, user component, copy all that, and paste it in here. All right, let's start hashing out our component a little more. We need this login method, we need this credentials object, which is going to hold our username and password. We'll also need success and error message. We'll have credentials, which is going to equal username, which is a blank to start, and password, which is also a blank to start. We'll have success message, which actually I don't think would be used that much since we're going to redirect after a user is successfully logged in. And error message, this is what we'll use more. And the login a user method. Now we don't have a service to log that user in yet. We'll go ahead and create that. Let's just play along here. We'll do some wishful coding. We'll say this.service.login, and we'll pass in a username and a password here. This.credentials.username and this.credentials.password. Now for a login method, we only need two things, and that's why I'm only passing in these two parts and not the whole credentials object. We want to make it very clear that this login will take a username and a password. .subscribe, and let's break this down into two parts. We'll have on success, which will give us data, and then we'll have on error, which will give us error. Let's do some more wishful coding. We will grab from shared services an auth service that we'll create in a second, auth service. And inside of the constructor, we'll call private service is equal to that auth service. Under shared services, create a new file called auth.service.ts. And this is where we'll create all of the information that needs to happen for authentication. This is where logging in will happen, this is where registering will happen, and this is where logging out will happen. This will also be the place where we're going to store that token into local storage, or we can clear it on logout. Let's go ahead and start our service, ng2 service, and that's going to be an injectable. We'll call it auth service. Just like we had our URL in the user service, we'll say private auth URL is going to be a string, and it will equal since we are going to make API calls, we'll need Angular HTTP, the HTTP library, and we'll pass in private HTTP is equal to HTTP. Let's go take a look at our API real quick. For login, successful, we're just passing in an email and a password. This API also allows us to pass in the username, and we'll do that instead of email. And what we get back is a token, and this is what will be stored in local storage. Something else I'd like to add to this, we'll have private logged in, which will be a variable, which is a boolean, and equal to false. And that will start us off as we are not logged in. When this app gets instantiated, we will look at local storage to check if the user is logged in. And this will happen in the constructor. This.loggedIn is equal to local storage.getItem auth token, and that's the name of what we'll store it as, auth_token. Now when we get information from local storage, it's important to note that local storage is a JavaScript object, and that's why we can call it without having to import it or anything like that. Right now our error is type string is not assignable to type boolean, and this is good old TypeScript telling us that this will return a string, but we want a boolean here. Now remember, in a couple courses ago, we were able to typecast something to a number using the plus sign. Here, to typecast to a boolean, we'll do exclamation mark, exclamation mark. And that's going to say, is it not auth token, which will return false or true, and then it'll say get the opposite of that, which will return it back to what it is. And that's just a quick way to typecast a Boolean. We'll have a method to check if the user is logged in, and this is really helpful in our components so that we could say this dot auth service or this dot service dot is logged in, and that will return if the user is logged in or not. That's how we can check in our components. Here we'll say is logged in, return this dot logged in. Next, we need to handle the log the user in, and this will be login. We'll pass in a username, which is a string, and a password, which is also a string. And let's get farther into our type hinting. We're going to return an observable with a string inside of it, and that string is the token. We need observable. Now we're getting an error here because we're not returning anything. Let's go ahead and do that now. Let's take a look at our API again. We have login, and that is a post request. Let's go ahead and do that to /API/login. Return this.http.post. We'll pass in the information, which is the this.auth URL/login. And our payload is going to be the username and password. .map res.json, and we'll .do res, which is the response. We'll say if the response has a token, local storage .set item, we'll call it auth token res.token, and catch this.handle error. We don't have this.handle error. Let's go grab that from user service. We need response here. Let's go grab that. Let's give this a shot. We'll go into that login component we have. We have auth service already. We already called this.service.login. Let's console log here, data, and then let's console error here, error. Let's see what comes back from this API. We'll go /login. And we're getting some errors here. Let's clean it up. No provider for auth service. All right, we created auth service. We didn't register it with our application, so our app doesn't really know how to use it. We'll go into app module. Under providers. All right, that should be good. Let's cross our fingers. We'll go to /login again. We see our login form. We'll type in my username and my password. Let's log in. Now we get the data, which is a token and that information. Perfect. If we look at our network tab, we have the login, post request to HTTP res API login, preview for what came back, we get a token. Exactly what we expected from our API. Let's delete password and do login again and see if an error gets logged out. We have login, missing password, perfect. Post gives us a 400 bad request. Console, bad request, missing password, perfect. Let's go look at our API. Under unsuccessful login, we get error, missing password, and a 400 response. Looks like our auth service is doing its job admirably. It's doing everything we need it to do. Since we were able to get a successful response from one of these, something that we already did was we stored the token into local storage. Let's make sure that that's actually there. we'll go into Application tab in Chrome, and if we look under, on the left, Application, Storage, Local Storage, and you pick the domain that you're on, we see our auth token is there. Looks like we're able to store that token and use it in our application. The very last step I'd like to take in this lesson, I know this one is starting to get a little long. Let's go here into our login component. After a successful login, let's route the user back to the home page. This.router.navigate, and that will redirect them back to the home page. Let's grab the router here. Pass it into the constructor. And let's give that a shot. My username, password, login. Our application is logged in. We have our token here. We have redirected over to the users, and everything is working perfectly. That will be good to showcase how an authentication login would work in an Angular2 app. Next up, let's deal with showing a login or logout button based on if a user is logged in or logged out, and we'll also deal with logging out.